In major ports of commerce and tourism, docking stations stretched as far as the eye could see, with entire cities built around them to accommodate travellers. By comparison, the cavernous hangar on Grover 9 was rather modest. An unwitting passerby might mistake it for a warehouse. The port's main occupants were cargo freighters on their regular supply runs and the occasional charter craft. The only visitors came to see family, and they usually didn't stay long. Nobody wanted to stay in a poor, shrinking colony unless they had nowhere else to go. The Fakovian customs officer looked surprised to see a military vessel armed to the teeth with weapons descending on their little port. I expected more terror at the sight of a human warship, but I suppose these people realized their planet was too meager a prize to appeal to the Earthlings. As we prepared to disembark, I considered leaving my gun behind. It would be a nuisance to lug a heavy rifle around. This trio didn't seem like they would pose any trouble to our party. I began to place the rifle back onto the weapons cart, but Joffrey pushed it back into my paws.
You're an idiot, Gorsh,
she growled.
A bunch of humans got moles chasing the ship, and you want to run up to it defenseless.
It's sitting idle in a tiny port, and it's days before the disaster. I gestured out of the airport towards the customs officers on the ground. I count 3 of them, and about 100 of us. What's the worst that could happen? She glared at me.
You've already seen the worst that can happen, but you do what you want.
With a sigh, I hoisted my rifle back onto my shoulders. My senses felt heightened, and my exhaustion had faded, but there was also an unusual agitation stealing my thoughts. I felt invincible, ready to run 1,000 clicks, with the newfound energy surging through my veins. I felt alive. Perhaps the brown drink Rykov gave me had been drugged. Now that I considered it, he had all but admitted it was some sort of mind-altering substance. The dark-haired human was standing by the airlock, looking rather displeased with General Blaise. That did not bode well for our team's cooperation. Bickering between the galaxy's 2 most aggressive species could easily end in violence. General Rykov's voice was low, but with my species' sharp hearing, I was able to make out his words.
And why exactly are you in charge? Last I checked, I outrank you.
The Corvian government is less than thrilled with the Terran warship landing on their territory,
Blaise answered.
They're worried you might leave a trail of bodies in your wake. They think you're on another, what's the human word? A crusade.
Another crusade? When have we ever attacked the Federation?
There was a hint of anger in Rykov's voice, and I noticed him clenching his fists.
We have never raised a finger against you. Lord knows we could have.
I beg to differ. There are several instances that come to mind.
Like?
Keelon.
The human recoiled as though he had been slapped. Clearly, there was a subtext that I did not understand. General Keelon had been Rykov's predecessor, a Jatari officer who was killed in action during the war. The venom in Blaise's voice suggested that he blamed the Terrans for his comrade's death, or he believed something more nefarious was afoot.
How dare you?
Rykov spat.
You have no idea what you're talking about.
I was his first officer. I know plenty.
Blaise's antennae twisted together as though he was trying to calm himself.
Look, I'm trying to help you. Announcing yourself as Terran military won't open a lot of doors, whereas the Jatari, we're respected. Just for once, let me do the talking.
Before the human could offer any protests, Blaise pulled the door handle and started down the landing ramp. After a brief moment of hesitation, Rykov followed, with the rest of our entourage in tow. The customs officer at the bottom barely looked up from her holopad, despite the presence of 50 armed personnel. Again, a lack of emotion struck me as odd, as did the fact that her partners had vanished.
Greetings, I'm Skitali. Please state the nature of your visit.
Military business. We're here to confiscate a Terran ship under the name Pisces.
Blaise said.
For what reason?
Skitali asked.
Not your concern. Take us there now, or you'll be an enemy of the Jatari.
Do you have a warrant? You can't.
Blaise waved his pistol at her, pressing it against her neck.
Here's my warrant. Move.
The Jatari general's brutish methods sickened me. No civilized soldier would resort to threats and bullying without any provocation. Here was the proof that the aggressive species were only as good as their reputation right in front of me. I risked a glance at Rykov and noticed that he looked as appalled as I felt. Why would it bother a human?
Blaise?
Rykov's voice dropped an octave, and it didn't escape my notice that he left out the general's title.
Put the weapon down, or I will put you down.
Will you?
There was a click as the human removed the safety on his gun.
Last warning. This is not how we treat civilians under my command.
With a furious snarl, Blaise lowered his weapon and turned all 3 eyes towards Rykov. If looks could kill, the human would have melted to a puddle then and there. The Terran general took a deep breath, trying to collect himself.
I apologize for my subordinate, Skitali. I'll be having some stern words with him, I assure you.
She nodded, strangely unperturbed.
It's all right. As I was saying, do you have a warrant? By law, I can't allow you to inspect or seize property without it.
I understand. I would never ask you to break the law if it weren't an emergency. Thousands of lives are at stake. There was no time to go through the traditional channels, not without how backlogged your courts are. We do have the direct permission of the Corvian government.
Sir, I'm sorry, but the politicians don't have that kind of authority.
You're right. We'll go through the proper steps as soon as we can, but right now we need your help. If we don't get to the ship in time, innocent people will die. Please, I'm begging you.
Well, just this once. Fine. Follow me.
General Rykov nodded his gratitude and followed Scutari toward the cordoned-off hangar at the back of the building. His behavior with her reminded me of the humanity we used to know. Diplomatic, meek, docile. But then he dropped back a bit, falling in at Blez's side, and the illusion dissolved. The rage smoldering in his brown eyes was primal.
You were worried about me leaving a trail of bodies. You were going to talk. What was that?
The human hissed.
Everything was under control until you interfered. I wasn't going to hurt her.
Blez shook his head, refusing to look at the human.
She wasn't cooperating. All that was needed was a bit of intimidation. You know, remind the rent-a-cops of their place. You can't show weakness like that. That groveling was pathetic. An embarrassment to your kind.
Rykov chuckled.
I'm an embarrassment. For asking nicely.
Yes. It's a wonder you ever got such a high rank.
I was thinking the same about you.
As worrisome as the thought of fisticuffs breaking out between two officers was, I found myself distracted by other concerns. The nagging thought lingered at the back of my mind that Scutari had complied a bit too easily. It was as though she'd only been stalling for time. Where had her partners gone? Maybe it was just the coffee drugs creating anxiety, but this did not pass the smell test. The customs officer pressed a button to open the hangar, and the metal door slowly slid aside. I made out a few dozen silhouettes crouched in fanning positions. The majority of the armed forces appeared to be human, which was rather unusual for a middle-of-nowhere colony. Well, that explained where the partners had gone, to round up the rest of the crew. Acting on instinct, I took Joffrey to the ground. Not a second later, gunfire erupted around us. Blood splattered onto my nose as a plasmanon tore through a human soldier in front of me. He dropped to the floor with a sickening thud, splayed out in a burgeoning pool of crimson. Shock pulsed through my chest as I realized how close that was to being me. Around us, several others fell, and more stumbled from non-fatal hits. Our attackers had gotten the drop on us with the ambush. Our surviving troops scrambled for cover, diving behind loose shipping containers and stray objects. Scutari was nowhere to be seen, so I assumed she rejoined her buddies once the fighting broke out. Our enemies noticed a group of terror soldiers crouched behind a refreshment station and tossed a round object toward them. The humans seemed to recognize the device and scrambled out of their hiding spot. Perhaps it was some sort of tool meant to push out stowaways, but the tiny ball looked harmless. The device detonated as soon as the thought crossed my mind. Despite its puny size, it at least a forceful blast that took down all in its vicinity. Right, everything with humans involved explosions. How could I forget? Bits of shrapnel rained out from the epicenter, maiming anyone who lacked shelter. This was a butcher's weapon, intended to inflict pain and suffering. I saw one human crawling away, dragging the blood-soaked remnants of her leg behind her. My knowledge of xenobiology was hazy, but if memory served me right, humans weren't capable of limb regrowth. What did they do with their wounded and impaired? Didn't they have a saying, only the strong survive? Perhaps the Terrans would leave this one to die, since it was doubtful she could walk again.
Dosh!
With a quick glance, I saw Joffrey crawling towards a stout metal container, where Rykov, Blez and a few of their men were waving us over. She seemed to have called my name several times.
Are you going to just lay there watching? Get your ass over here!
I wriggled over to the makeshift shelter, propping myself against the cool surface. Rykov and Blez were crouched side by side, Coral forgotten, returning fire. Facing off against a force that was primarily human didn't bode well for me, but it was better than sitting back on my paws. I reached for my rifle and peered over the container with my scope. If I was to die on the mission, I might as well go down shooting.